Hello, and good evening. I'm Mark Etkind. I'm the president and CEO of CHM. Brand new, 2 months on the job, and it's really great to see some familiar faces, to see some long-term supporters, and to welcome all the new folks to our community at this incredible museum. The museum's mission is to decode technology, to understand the past, to inform the present, and inspire the future. And tonight we're going to focus on how cutting-edge technology is helping us unravel mysteries of the past. Most of us have learned about the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius, how it destroyed Pompeii and nearby Herculaneum. Tonight we'll learn about the amazing advances in AI that have allowed researchers to begin to decipher some scrolls that we thought were destroyed in the eruption. Some of you may know I spent the last 4 years at NASA. One of my roles at NASA was to help develop and communicate their responsible AI process. And if you think about space travel, the distances we have, if you want to explore planets, if you want to analyze the incredible amount of data coming back from our satellites, you need AI. And tonight's example, like NASA's, we're going to be talking, and like those NASA examples, the use of AI we'll be talking about tonight illustrates the scientific revolution to come. Tonight's program would not be possible without the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, so please join me in thanking them for their generous support. We'd like to invite you all to participate in the program tonight by submitting questions and answering audience polls. Either in person or online, just scan the QR code using your smartphone's camera. And if you have any problems with that, just use slido.com and type in CHM. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening. Russell Eyrig has been a senior producer and manager of programming at CHM for 3 years. Please welcome Russell Eyrig. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to introduce the rest of our panel. Our first guest is Federica Nicolardi. Federica is the assistant professor of papyrology at the University of Naples, Federico II. Her research primarily focuses on the Herculaneum papyri, with a special emphasis on critical editions and virtual restoration techniques. Please welcome Federica. Federica, I did it again. Sorry. Next, we have Brent Seals. Brent is the Stanley and Karen Pigman Chair of Heritage Science and Professor of Computer Science at the University of Kentucky. He is the founder of the Heritage Science Research Lab at the university and also co-founded the Vesuvius Challenge, an international contest with the goal to virtually unwrap the Herculaneum scrolls. Please welcome Brent Seals. Some real wildcats down here. Okay. And finally, Nat Friedman. Nat is an investor and entrepreneur who launched the Vesuvius Challenge with Daniel Gross and Brent Seals in 2023. He was also the CEO of GitHub and former chairman of the Gnome Foundation. Please welcome Nat Friedman. So I wanted to start by just getting to know you a little bit and trying to connect with what you do. I mean, I'm not a papyrologist or a computer scientist or an investor. I work for a nonprofit, so that's not going to happen. So let's start with you, Federica. What exactly does a papyrologist do?
Yeah, so papyrologists study not only papyri, because that's what we would think probably, but in general, papyrologists study ancient texts written on light supports, meaning, for example, papyri, but also ostraca, so pottery, for example, pieces of pottery, but also tablets or other supports like parchment, and they have to study both the materiality and the text. So you have to deal with all this material and the restoration, for example, and at the same time work on the interpretation of the documentary or literary text you can read on it.
Okay. Was this something you always wanted to do?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Actually, when I was studying at school, I had already decided to specialize in classics. I didn't know much about papyrology, but I remember when I was reading all the exams that I would take in my course, and I saw papyrology, I say, oh, okay, this is very interesting. And then during my bachelor degree, I didn't pick papyrology as an optional exam. I picked it at the master's, and I said, okay, now I found what I want to do in my life.
Wow, well, that's great. So Brent, moving on to you. How does a computer scientist end up working on these ancient damaged documents?
Yeah, it was an interesting path for me in the era of the internet, the mid-90s, which was when my career was starting. Digitizing books and putting them online was important because we were creating basically the largest digital library in human history. But what I could see even then is that the damaged material and the difficult to access material would be left behind. And it created for me a little corner of that universe that was interesting, and I never could have imagined how interesting when Herculaneum came on the scene.
Nice, nice. And so Nat, how did you get connected in all of this, and what's the story there?
Yeah, I mean, it's also a sort of strange story. I don't know how we all stumbled into this situation together, but it was early 2020, and we were in kind of COVID lockdown, and I had this job running GitHub, which was good overall, but there were some rough moments. And so just between COVID and my job, I was kind of stressed out and wasting time on the internet, and I ended up late one night sort of stumbling on Wikipedia about, an article about the existence of this ancient library that had been buried by a volcanic eruption and was sort of unreadable, but preserved and unique in that way. And it was just like the most fascinating thing. And then I think a few clicks later, I found out about Brent's efforts that had been going on for a while to use particle accelerators and computer vision and machine learning to try to read these things. And I just thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard about. And so I thought, gosh, I want to follow along and see what happens with this project. And then I think a year or two had passed, and I kind of hadn't heard, that it was solved. And so I cold emailed Brent and just said, hey, I think what you're doing is really cool. What I didn't know is that and now I know, is that if you work on these kind of projects, you get a lot of crackpot emails. And because I also now get a lot of crackpot emails. And so it took several attempts to get in touch with Brent, but we eventually did chat, and he was sort of like, how can I help you? And eventually we met and ended up figuring out that it would be fun to work together.
I've got to ask, what's an example of a crackpot email in this instance?
Oh, well, there are a lot of them. I mean, there's definitely a lot of like, hey, we found these scratches on the side of this mountain, and we need your help to decode them. Like lots of, I've heard from 3 or 4 people who believe they have decoded Linear A, the ancient Minoan language. I have no ability to judge whether they decoded it or not, but they think that I will adjudicate that. And so, yeah, just stuff like that.
Gotcha. So if you're listening and you're thinking of emailing something like that, just
Yeah.
maybe hold off for now.
My email is out there. You can
Right. Well, I wanted to go back in time a little bit and ask you to tell me a little bit about Herculaneum around 79 CE, and what was life like at that time? I don't know who's the best person to answer this question too, so.
Perhaps me?
Anyone pop in.
Federica.
I can start if
Federica's
you want, but I want to add something. Yeah, when we think about Herculaneum, we usually think about what happened with Vesuvius, but the city was actually a pretty vibrant city. We know it because we know the structure of the city. It was like a classical Latin Roman city divided in insulae, so in a very square way, and the city had a lot of tabernes, so a lot of shops, and thermopolia. So
Wait, what was the last one?
the thermopolia. So it was
what is
like
that?
ancient fast foods or something like that.
Oh, okay. I'm more interested now. Ancient fast food, love it.
And of course, houses, public buildings, and a lot of the city of Herculaneum is actually still buried because the city was sealed and buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. We know that the city actually was often shaken by earthquakes. This happened a lot. There was a severe earthquake in '62, and then it happened very often, especially right before the eruption. People were kind of used to that, and that's something that is actually happening right now in Naples too. We're pretty used to having earthquakes. But the city was a very vibrant city, as I was saying before, and it had different types of houses, and just one villa, as far as we know, the Villa dei Papiri.
Okay.
It was a little bit outside of the main city.
So what do we know about the eruption that happened?
Yeah, about the eruption, we know especially from Pliny the Younger, who tells us about what his uncle was seeing at the time, so Pliny the Elder. We know that probably the eruption started around midday, probably was around 1 p.m. And it started with massive explosions. And then there was this very high column coming up from Vesuvius. It was more than 20 kilometers high. And then from there, all the ashes and pumices started falling to the south of the Mount Vesuvius, and they covered especially Pompeii. Herculano, so the city of Herculaneum, was in the very first place protected by the wind. And then it received the pyroclastic surges that fell down, because at some point, this big pine tree column that is very typical with the Plinian eruption started to collapse, and it hit with this pyroclastic surges, so basically very high temperature gases. It fell on the city of Herculaneum, and it caused, so this is the reason why the eruption had different effects in Pompeii and in Herculaneum. Because in Pompeii, there were all the previous part of the eruption hit very, very severely, and it didn't allow for conservation of organic material, which actually happened in Herculaneum because all these pyroclastic surges and this mud, basically high temperature mud, kind of sealed the environment without any oxygen, so things couldn't get burned. They were carbonized, as happened to papyri, but also to other things like wood, for example, or even bread or seeds, or things like that. So the organic material was preserved in Herculaneum.
Okay, interesting. And when...
The other thing, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, no, please.
Just stuff that I was surprised to learn about when I got after that Wikipedia visit was that Herculaneum was actually buried in like 60 feet of mud. So I think maybe for some reason before I thought it would be like a thin layer, but it was like an extremely thick layer of mud that sealed it, which is part of why those cities were not found for 1,700 years roughly. Is it was deep, and they were eventually discovered by Italian well diggers or farmers, I think, something like that, or at least, is that true?
So they started, the excavation started officially in 1738,
Okay.
but there were people already discovering things, as we were saying, farmers especially in wells, in their properties. They knew that from wells there were ancient objects or ancient statues, marbles coming out. So they probably knew at some point that there was an ancient city there, but they hadn't excavated it in a systematic way. And even in the 18th century, even in 1738, we don't have to think about like an archaeological excavation as we do today, of course. It was more like an exploration or something like that, by tunnels. Very complicated, as Nat was saying, because the layer was particularly thick and also pretty hard, so it was very difficult to excavate in the city of Herculaneum, and very dangerous because the whole thing could fall or collapse. And also there were volcanic gases coming from the soil, so it was very dangerous.
Let me just say I've learned a ton from these people working together with them. Nat's incredibly well-read. Federica's an expert. But I could also say that Ridley Scott has made a few movies that will teach you a lot about the ancient world as well.
Yeah.
So check those out.
Yeah. Did you know any?
No, I didn't know any of
this
that.
was not anything that was on your radar.
Not
before?
part of the computer science curriculum.
Right,
Data
yeah.
structures does not teach you anything about this. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. So that's fascinating, though. They weren't discovered. I feel like when you hear 1738 to us, that seems like, oh, that was forever ago. But it's like it's so much closer to us today than it was to that eruption. It's like it's almost 1,700 years between the eruption and the discovery. That's really fascinating. So I guess I was curious when they were discovered, when the scrolls were found, and actually. We do have I want to show a picture of the scroll here, of what they look like. Did people try to read them immediately?
Not immediately. Should I start with that? Do you want to do that?
Well, I think they didn't know they were scrolls in the very beginning, and maybe you can say what happened.
Yeah, so we know that also from people who then started to work on trying to open the scrolls, that at the very beginning when they were finding papyri, of course, they couldn't understand what they were. And we don't have to judge this thing. It's completely normal, first of all, because they don't look like books. They don't look like even like scrolls, because they're very compact and compressed and very irregular in their shape, and pretty black, of course, difficult to connect to what we are used to when we think about papyrus, because papyrus is kind of yellowish. But also the main thing is that when the papyri were found for the first time, the first finding was October 19, 1752, and no papyrus had ever come to Europe from Egypt by that time. So the first papyrus came to Europe from Egypt in 1778. So no one really knew how a scroll would look like. So it's not surprising at all that they weren't able to recognize it. And then at some point, as they say, some of the scrolls broke off, so that there were some pieces coming off, and they were able to see some ink and some letters. So they finally understood that they were books, and they tried to open them because, of course, that was the first challenge when they understood, okay, these are books, and now how can we access the text in these books? How can we open them? And they tried it in several ways, very drastic sometimes. So even the very first attempt carried out by the head of the museum, let's say the Herculaneum Museum, where they were bringing everything from the excavation, was just cutting the scrolls along their length to be able to reveal some text and just show it to the king, to tell him, look at what we've done. We've recovered some text. But this was a very drastic method. Then, I don't know if Brent wants to say.
Well, there's probably a 50-year span of early attempts that basically created terrible destruction. And to frame it with the history that I knew, Daniel Boone was opening up Kentucky.
Yeah.
And Lewis and Clark had not yet started their expedition, right, to the west. Right? This is the American history parallel with what was happening in Herculaneum. Yeah.
And I think we have an image also of some of those attempts of opening the scroll. So if we can show that.
There are even some better papyri. So this is probably not very well preserved. As you can see, there is this membrane at the bottom of the papyrus, and in some cases you can see that the piece of papyrus is pretty well preserved. So, and this was opened through a machine, so-called Piaggio's machine, because the inventor was this Antonio Piaggio. He was actually an expert in illuminated manuscripts from the Vatican, and he invented this very smart, actually, machine that was able to very slowly unroll the papyrus using this membrane that you can see at the bottom of the papyrus, which is called membrana di battiloro, so a goldsmith membrane, and then some silk threads, and basically gravity and traction to very, very slowly unroll the scroll. And in some cases, the results are pretty good. In other cases, they're really bad because the papyri were very compressed and all the layers where there was the cohesion between the layers was so high that it was very difficult to separate them from each other, and that's one of the main problems with it.
When I first started working on this project, I hadn't seen one of these things except on Wikipedia, and so I wanted to see what it would be like, and it turns out you can go on Amazon and order papyrus from Egypt that is pretty similar, I think, to how it's made out of the same plant and roughly the same method, and then you can write something on it and roll it up, which I did, and then you can put it in a Dutch oven to try to, you know,
which you did.
Create an anoxic environment, and then you put that in. If you have a pizza oven, that's good because they get very hot. If you don't, you put it inside your oven, and then you just like let it cook for a really long time. Now, I think it was something like 1,500 degrees was the estimated temperature of the mud. My pizza oven goes that hot, but at the time I didn't have a pizza oven. So you put it in there and you cook it up, and then so I think I would recommend this exercise because it's pretty cool to see. And then you get this flaky, light, incredibly delicate object out, and you can try all the early 1750s techniques to try to open it. Cut it with a knife. They would soak it in water. At some point, they poured mercury into them, thinking that mercury, might slip between the layers because it's slippery. Turns out that mercury is also very heavy, and it just sort of crushes parts of the ash, or it's not quite ash, but the carbonized papyrus. So yeah, it gave me a good sense for like the difficulties of reading these scrolls because the papyrus is made of 2 layers of plant fibers. They're laminated together, so you have sort of vertical fibers underneath and horizontal slats on top that you write on. Those will delaminate, it blisters, like all this, it's super messed up. And so sort of seeing that yourself in your own scroll is, it's your homework.
I do not know if we should recommend people
No, it's fine, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nat says it's okay, all right.
It's totally great.
All right, well.
Just open a window before you take it out of the oven. A lot of smoke.
All right, well, I wanted to sort of bring us up closer to the present, at least, and when did people realize the technology had advanced enough that we might be able to read these in a different way? And maybe this is for you, Brent, I'm not sure.
Well, it's been, 275 years since discovery, and every era, right, has applied its technology for reading. Photography, of course, changed things because there were facsimiles that were made in the late 1800s. Some of those facsimiles then were made with infrared photography, and then it was discovered that actually infrared incident light, even with regular analog film, could make the contrast of the writing, which is essentially black on black for the ones that have been opened. It could make that contrast much more readable. And so then we start this race, photography's changed, it became digital, right? And this race to use the new technology to continue to improve, and that's happened right up to present day, right?
Okay, and so how did we get to this sort of AI point, I guess, and what was that transition like?
Well, for sure, there was a moratorium eventually on physically opening them because at some point...
It was surprisingly late, though.
Surprisingly late.
When was the last physical attempt to open?
So it started in the 80s and went up to the beginning of this century. They were basically using gelatin and acetic acid and tweezers to physically detach layers in the scroll. And they produced an enormous amount of fragments that are just glued on rice paper, so Japanese paper, very light and just very difficult to consult and very fragile, of course. But this was the last attempt to physically
It's like
open
2005?
2001 to the last attempts, yeah.
Wow. And so then how did whose idea was it to try using AI? It's this guy, okay.
Well, virtual unwrapping was my idea back in the day to get at the scrolls that hadn't been opened at all. And there was this idea that we could maybe do better than any of the ones that had been physically opened, even though the damage was profound, by choosing a non-invasive method, like with X-ray and with tomography. And that turned out to be a great idea that was incredibly hard to implement. And it was AI really that rescued us on the last stage, right, of what we really needed to make that work. And Nat, I mean, you came to the team when we were working through that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the process that's worked so far to get text out of the scrolls is basically, I think, 4 parts. You get a scroll, and you put it in an X-ray source, and Brent had the smart idea to use a particle accelerator to produce the X-rays because we can get much better scans out of that, and originally scanned a couple of scrolls at the Diamond light source near Oxford, England. And so then you get out of that, and then you do a tomographic reconstruction, you get a 3D volume of voxels, which shows you kind of the density, the radio density to X-rays of each point in this column of it's sort of black burrito, that you've scanned. And then the next, so that's sort of, step 1 is you scan it. Step 2 is you want to now find, so in theory, it's just a spiral of papyrus. But of course, it's damaged, it's bent, there's cracks, there's blisters, there's delamination, there's layers that have been smushed together and are really stuck together, the sort of compressed regions. And so actually just figuring out how you can trace the surface of the wound papyrus inside this distorted spiral is really hard. And so that's what you need to do. You need to sort of find the surface of the papyrus. So if you were to unroll the papyrus in front of you, it would be like a long rectangle that's maybe like this big and as much as like 15 meters long. I'm looking to Federica to make sure I'm saying the right things. And then they would write on it in columns. So you'd have like a column of text here, and then next to it another column of text, and another column of text. And that long piece of papyrus, in fact, was made of several sheets that were glued together. And so now, so there's a double thickness of the overlap areas. And so now you have to sort of reconstruct this. And Brent and his team had built some software that you can use to try to semi-manually, with a little bit of augmentation, trace this sort of surface of the papyrus, but it hadn't yet been done at any kind of big scale inside of a scroll. And then once you do that, you can just geometrically flatten it, and you kind of, instead of dealing in the 3D volume, you can kind of flatten it out as in your computer. And you get sort of a flattened sheet as if you had physically unrolled it, you virtually unrolled it. But then your problem is you have to find the ink. And the real trick with the Herculaneum papyri, we're using X-rays, and everybody's gotten an X-ray. People have had a CT scan. You look at them. I broke my wrist a couple times actually, and you get an X-ray and you can see your bones. They're very clear. They're white, and then your other tissues are darker because the bones are denser under X-rays. The problem with the Herculaneum papyri is that the ink has essentially the same radio density as the papyrus, and so you can't see it in the X-ray. Like, it is certainly not readily apparent, and we don't know quite why. I think the theory is that the papyrus is carbon-based and the ink maybe is also very carbon-based. I think the theory is that it's made of like oil lamp soot or something like that. So if you get a Roman oil lamp, you put some olive oil in it, and then it makes soot, and then you can write with some densified version of that with some water. And so finding the ink problem turned out to be like quite difficult, and Brent and his team had already made some progress on this, not so much in a scroll, but in some of these broken off fragments to show that they could make machine learning models that could validate and replicate the visible ink in a broken off fragment. And so the question was, could we trace the papyrus in a scroll? Could we figure out how to find ink inside of the scroll itself? That hadn't been done yet. And so that was sort of the point where I got involved, and I met Brent through that cold email, or series of emails, and he was, we sort of hit it off, and so it was sort of like, hey, maybe it would be fun. I suggested maybe it would be fun to, I come from an open source background, so I grew up in the 90s on the internet, kind of in what is now called the open source world. It's like, should we create an open source project out of this, or maybe some kind of contest or something? And I didn't understand how unusual this was at the time. I only came to appreciate it when I thought about it later. But Brent was like, that's a great idea. Like, that would be a really fun thing to do. For an academic who's been chasing this quest for years, like I now realize the tremendous open-mindedness and generosity that was encouraged, that was required for Brent to react that way. But we decided to do that. And that's what led to the Vesuvius Challenge. And the idea was to get these data sets out to smart people on the internet, wherever they were, and have them look at it and see if they could solve the unsolved problems that had been vexing us for years, 275 years.
Maybe we can have Nat keep talking and saying nice things about me. Then.
Yeah. You owe me $100.
Well, Brent, I mean, do you have anything else to add to what Nat said?
Well, the artificial intelligence part, which Nat field deployed at GitHub, right? Copilot, which was one of the first kind of aids that the world saw in coding anyway, right? Related to this whole AI large language model surge that we now see. And so he was the right person to help me extend toward a kind of AI approach that would help us make that ink that's so hard to see more visible. And so there's this enhancement problem that was kind of unsolved and open. And being able to use the contest to really push hard on that turned out to be a key that opened up the next phase of the project. And so AI has really been, I would call it analytical AI, not generative AI, but the ability to enhance evidence of the ink that's not visible to your naked eye, but is still there. That evidence is still there. And using AI to do that was a huge step forward.
Talk a little bit more about that difference, because I don't know if everybody understands what the difference is between generative AI and this process that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, analytical AI has been around for a while. These basic techniques that form the AI ecosystem of trying to learn something from examples, right, and then infer on a set of data that you haven't seen before based on what you've learned before, these examples, right? That's basically what I'm talking about, rather than sort of generating something new or inferring a higher level thing like text or a language model. All of the work we've done is really enhancing the signal of the ink, the evidence of the ink in the tomography.
Got it, got it. So tell me about the challenge that you set up. How does somebody actually win?
Yeah.
What's the process for that?
Well, I'm kind of proud of this part, because after Brent and I chatted and he said, yeah, we should figure something out, I drove home from our conversation and it was sort of like, okay, how are we going to do this? And the more we sort of talked and I thought about the problem, the more I realized it's really hard, and there's like many things that you have to figure out in order to get text out of a scroll, many of which were not figured out. And at the time, to be honest, I didn't even know if it was going to work. Like, I thought maybe there was a 30% chance that by the end of the year we could get some text out of a scroll. But I thought it was worth a try because it was so cool. And so, so the challenge is, if you just want to do a contest and you're going to have like a big grand prize for, you pulled 2 pages of text out of this, if it's extremely difficult and requires solving 5 or 6 different problems to get there, then the most likely thing that happens is that like different people or teams will work on it a little bit, they'll make a little bit of progress in different areas, but then it's so hard that they'll just give up, and then their little bits of progress will get lost. And so the idea that we came up with was to have still a big grand prize for pulling the first big blocks of text out of a scroll that had never been opened before. Do that, because it'll excite people and be prestigious, but then also offer little progress prizes along the way to people who make, figure something out about the unrolling, or, are able to improve the ink detection algorithms a little bit, or make a tool that is helpful to the research that goes into all of this. And we called those progress prizes, and, they would be a little dopamine hit for the contestant, but it was conditioned on open sourcing your work. So you could kind of win little prizes along the way. You just have to open source your work, and then other people can build on it. So that we thought that way everybody can sort of raise the water level, build on each other, get us closer to the possibility of someone winning this grand prize. And that worked really, really well. Like, not only did it actually go the way we thought it would, which was that people did work, got recognized, and made progress available to other people, but it became addictive to the participants, because they sort of heard about the project and they went to the website and they did something small and they got a prize. Maybe they got $500 or $1,000 and they felt good about that. And they're like, I'm going to do a little bit more. And so we would take people kind of along this journey from being, we called it scroll curious to like eventually to scroll obsessed. And there are some deeply scroll obsessed people now.
Like the three of us, I would say.
Yeah. Who just can't give it up until it's done. And so that was sort of like maybe the main, sort of mechanistic invention of the contest itself was this idea of these, open source progress prizes.
And we do have a picture of one of these virtually unscrolled. So I think, comparing this to the previous attempts at physical unfurling, I think is pretty obvious.
Yeah, so this is this was our, what year is this, 25? So this is the 2023 grand prize winning submission. It's bigger than this. It looks small here, so I don't know if it scrolls or something.
It's only 3 strips here, and it's 2 strips, and it's usually 3.
So this makes it look like we didn't do that much, but we did better than this.
It looks like a lot.
Oh, it does? Okay. Yeah, so this was a miracle. I mean, so actually what happened next after we launched the contest, people start doing some stuff, was actually the next thing that happened was we realized that there was this critical step in this process that contestants weren't going to do, which was this sort of manual tracing of the wound papyrus. And so we realized, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months in, geez, like no one wants to do this for fun on the weekend. We have to hire a full-time team to do this. And so we went out and we hired maybe a dozen or so people whose full-time job was to look at these cross-section x-rays of papyrus and click on them, basically, to sort of indicate, to follow the spiral. And this sounds easy and boring. It's actually very, very hard because of the scan quality. So anyway, we hired a bunch of people to do that, and we started basically then doing the flattening ourselves and putting out these flattened segments to the community, and therefore we reduced the problem in the community to just like find the ink in here. And that became the big challenge for the community, and we didn't really find any ink until one contestant who was actually somebody I knew, this guy Casey. He took an unusual approach to trying to find ink. Everyone else was running these ML models and trying to do transfer learning and all this stuff. And Casey just looked at the X-rays for hours. And with his eyes, he said, like, okay, I have a neural network already. It's in my head, so I'll just look at these until I can figure out what's going on in them. And he identified different sort of, okay, that's a crack. I think that's a crack. And these little dots are mineral concretions in the papyrus plant. And then he eventually noticed after maybe 20 or 30 hours of this, these strange patterns that looked like a dried lake bed. Sort of, we call it cracked mud or crackle, and he thought that might be dried ink. And then he sort of sent that out to the whole community, and that was the revelation that Luke Ferrator, who was an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska, built on when he decided, I'll take these little crackle areas, I'll train a ink detection model on them, and see if I can find more ink that looks like this. And that led to the first word that we found in the scroll, and that was, gosh, late summer of 23, I think. So, and it was a very interesting word. Maybe Federica can talk about it. It wasn't like but or...
No, that was pretty lucky, actually, because it was not Kai, like and, or Allah, but it was the word porphyras, the word purple, which is not the most common word. And of course, it's very difficult. I remember at the time, people from the media were asking us all the time, why do we have this word in this papyrus? So so we had just one word out of probably around 150 columns of text. So it's like, I don't know, taking just one word in the whole Shakespeare production and try to understand what's that about. So it was a difficult question to understand, to answer, of course, at that time. And even now, we don't know precisely what that specific column means. Probably purple is an example to talk about luxurious clothes or something like that. Or it could also be something about color, because we know that the text is about perceptions and sensations, and so purple could be used in talking about sight, so talking about the sense of sight. So that's a hypothesis, because that column is still a little bit fragmentary, so we don't know precisely what it means. But I mean, right after that, after Luke's image, a couple of weeks after, we received a much better image, so a much longer image by Yusuf Nader. So he was able to read parts of 5 different columns. That was striking. I mean, I remember for me, it was really striking, because we were reading just one word and seeing a couple of letters to the left and to the right of that word. And then at some point, just all of a sudden, we could read pieces of 5, 6 columns. And I remember at that time, I was flying to Kentucky because Brent was hosting a symposium there in Lexington. And before my flight, people from the Vesuvius Challenge technical team asked me, things are evolving pretty fast. Can we keep you in the loop? And I was, okay, yeah, of course you can. And during my flight, I received that image. So when I landed in Lexington, I just saw the image, and I was completely, it was crazy, because it was like a huge improvement in such a short time.
It was an electric moment, it really was.
Yes.
While we have this image up, could I just give a little narration? The lower right is the innermost part of the scroll, and you can see that column sort of ends, and the scallops on the top represent the wraps. If you take a paper towel roll and you cut the top off at an angle and then you unroll it, you'll see these spikes for every wrap. And so you can see how tight they are in the lower right, and one column spans 2 or 3 wraps, right? And then in the upper left, you see that one column only spans 1 wrap of the scroll, and we have text all the way through the whole scroll. So that just gives you a little insight into the geometry of the virtually unwrapped image that you're seeing.
And if I can add something, that's really interesting, because that's exactly one of the elements that we use also for the virtual reconstruction of open papyri. So it's like really working on the same type of thing. So even when Nat was talking about the complex, so the difficulty of doing segmentation on the unopened scrolls, that's exactly the same difficulty that people were facing when they were trying to do physical unwrapping. So the papyri are really difficult to open, because there's this high compression and cohesion and everything. So segmentation is like the unwrapping of the scroll. So if it's the same thing if you're thinking about physical or virtual, the difficulty is exactly the same. The only difference is that we're not destroying it. So
right.
that's not a tiny.
We haven't, no scrolls were harmed in this production.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Yes.
Well, you mentioned the first word. How much do we know now? Like, how much has been translated or transcribed or whatever?
Of this specific papyrus, we have now around 15 columns and just a small part of the end of another one. So we have 16 columns, we might say, and especially we have the two-thirds of the upper part of those columns. And the text actually fits very well into the library that we know about because of the open scroll. So it's, the library from Herculaneum is very peculiar, especially the Greek part of it. It includes both Greek and Latin scrolls, but the Greek scrolls that are usually better preserved than the Latin ones are all part of a specialized library. It's a philosophical library, so all the books we have found so far are philosophical books. And almost all of them are connected to Epicurean philosophy. And this text is also an Epicurean text. It's an interesting text because it was nice because among the first words we were reading, of course, there was Porphyras, and also we noticed very quickly a couple of occurrences of the word musicae, so music, which was also pretty interesting. And then we found the word hedone, which means pleasure in Greek. And that's also interesting because it's a key word in Epicureanism, because so that the main, the most important thing for a wise man was to achieve pleasure, meaning the absence of turbulence, the absence of pain. And then we kept on reading, and we were finding things about perception, sensations, also very physical aspects of that. So how the aggregates of atoms bump into the organ of senses or things like that. And then some examples from food, from the field, probably talking about taste, and then from music, as I was saying before. So we don't know precisely the title of this work, because as Brent was saying, we have the last part of the text. You can see the so-called agraphon, so the part that is unwritten at the end of the scroll, but we cannot see the title yet. So it's probably hidden somewhere below the last column or to the right of it, but we cannot, we haven't been able to find it yet. We will read it at some point. So we don't know precisely the title of the whole work and the topic of the whole work. So of course, as I was saying before, it's 16 columns out of 160. So it's difficult to say, especially at the end of a work, the author might have been wrapping up or opening up to another book of the same work, for example. So it's not very easy to understand if the text is in general on perceptions or if it's on something peculiar and the ending part of the work is broadening up a little bit on other perceptions and other senses too. So it might be a text on music, for example, that ends with examples from other fields, other senses, or it might be a text on perception with several examples from different senses, for example.
My favorite part, I may get this wrong, but somewhere in the second to last column or last column, he seems to be, the author, Philodemus, who's this Epicurean philosopher, seems to be taking a swipe at his philosophical rivals, and maybe the Stoics. And he says, I think I got this right. He says they have nothing to say about pleasure, either in general or specifically. And I think that's like a pretty legitimate criticism of Stoicism, actually. Like, wait a second, yeah, it's sort of a missing part of the philosophy. So, yeah, you can read this when we got that translation back from the papyrologist, from Federica and her team. I thought, oh, this is just a blog post, and they're just beefing with each other.
Yeah.
Yes, that's very common, actually, Hellenistic philosophical schools. Yeah.
An ancient diss track, basically.
Yeah, kinda, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a few more questions, but I also want to remind everyone here that they can ask questions. And so I want to show that QR code one more time. So if you didn't see it before or didn't type in slido.com and go to use event code CHM, you can ask the questions. But I wanted to kind of ask about what's next for the process. And, with rapid advances in generative AI, will these help your understanding of ancient mysteries like the scrolls?
God, I hope so. This is a really hard project, and we are nowhere near done. So if anybody here is computational geometer or wants to work on this, we really could use your help, is my basic point. Yeah, I mean, something strange is going on where we got all this text out of one of the scrolls, and we've now found text, but not quite as much in another scroll. But we have a whole bunch of scrolls we can't find text in, and we're not really sure why. And so that's our puzzle. That's what we're working on. And so we want to find much more text. One thing we have tried to do recently, which has given us a lot of hope, is that we found a particle accelerator that produces much better images. Are we allowed to talk about this? You're giving me a look. Okay. Well, anyway, we went to Grenoble, and at ESRF, they have really awesome particle accelerator. I guess Mark Zuckerberg paid for a really good beamline and optics setup there. And so we rented time on this, and we put some of the scrolls in there. We brought actually quite a few scrolls from Naples up, and the images are stunning. Like, we thought that our scans were good before until we saw these. And they're so much clearer, and the resolution's so much better. So maybe that will solve the mystery of the missing text, just having better scans. We're going through them now and trying to figure that out. But yeah, we're clearly doing something wrong in either the segmentation step where we trace it, or we trace the surface of the papyrus, or we're missing some ink pattern that may vary between the scrolls. So maybe the type of ink is different between the scrolls. Maybe the machine learning model that detected the ink in one of the scrolls was picking up on a particular pattern that's not present in the others for some reason. We don't quite know. So what's next is to figure that out, because there are hundreds of scrolls, and we want to read them all. And the project, I won't be free of this project until that's done. And so that's, yeah, so we need help.
Well, it's right. It's an enormous collection. And scaling up is a much different problem than doing one or two. I want to pick up where you left off. There are many ways that you could help, including giving some money to encourage us with funding, because the work does encompass a collection that is maybe 400 books from the ancient world. And it hasn't really been since the Renaissance that it's been possible to have the potential of that much writing that is from the classical period directly, not medieval copies, right? So we're really talking about kind of a 500 or 600 year high of being able to deliver these texts from the scrolls that they're locked into using these technical means. But it is by no means a simple challenge. There are many mysteries yet to be solved.
Anything you're looking forward to in the future with this project?
Yes, I would be very happy to read more texts, of course. Yes, in general, I think I would be very curious to read the Latin papyri. So as I was saying before, for now, we've read some of the Latin papyri, but they're usually more damaged than the Greek ones. And it is very difficult to understand what the text inside of them is. And in some cases, so in one particular case, we have the end title, and we know that it's a very rare work by Seneca the Elder, but we cannot really appreciate the text because it's too fragmentary. So the thing that strikes me the most when I think about this project is the potential to read a complete text, to read a whole scroll, because that's really unique. That's something that you cannot do anywhere else. So.
Maybe I have a question for you, Federico. When was the last time a papyrologist of any ilk, of any kind, was able to deliver to the scholarly world a brand new text from the classical period?
No, this happens pretty often if you're talking about fragments. So if you take, for example, the last volume of the Oxyrhynchus papyri, you will find several papyri published there that include material and works that haven't been transmitted by any other source. So that happens very often. But most of the time you have like one column or just a tiny bit of a column. Here we're talking about entire works, so the perspective is completely different.
So the answer then for an entire work is almost never?
Yes.
Okay, all right, good. That was the answer I was hoping for.
And how much is left to still excavate there? Are there still scrolls buried?
Definitely. There's a whole city that's buried. I mean, Herculaneum is not fully excavated because there's another city on top of it, the new one, and so they don't want to move. So that makes it tough. So yeah, I mean, basically because, as Federica explained, of the way the volcanic mud flowed, Herculaneum in that area was uniquely, sort of received unique volcanic treatment that was papyrus preserving in a weird way. And so any papyrus scrolls that were like in any house in Herculaneum, I would guess were preserved in exactly the same way. It's also the case that the villa where these papyri were found, I didn't really understand this until getting into it and then going there. It wasn't excavated in the way we think of most archaeological excavations today, which are top down, where you start at the ground level and you get all the dirt out until you fully expose the structure. Almost all of the excavation of this villa was done through tunnels, almost all of which were in the 18th century, and they're extremely limited in scope. There's been a little bit of top-down excavation done of one corner of it, which was in the 1990s, and they discovered that it had like 2 extra stories that they didn't know about when they did that. And so the historians that we talked to hypothesized that, in fact, the library that was recovered is not the main library from this villa, that, in fact, there could be a much larger Latin library in a villa of this type. If that's true, that would be completely crazy. And so, yes, we think if we can read a whole scroll, they will dig out everything, because we will be able to find thousands and thousands of works that are lost. And to me, that's the thing I'm most excited about. I do think that, someone gave me this great phrase that, we're using the technology of the future to bring the past into the present, which I thought was really cool. And it makes me think, actually, that like you could imagine a spaceship of some advanced alien civilization that just comes to your planet and kind of scans it, and then just based on what's in the topsoil and its detailed scan, it can write the complete history of everything that ever happened on this planet. Maybe tell you, the most beautiful works of your great poets, stuff like that. I think that just seems physically possible. I mean, we will basically, our knowledge of the past will approach the Shannon limit of the communication channel of dirt, essentially. And so we will eventually know everything that can be physically known. So I think it's inevitable that this will just work, and we will be able to read everything.
Well, I think we can go on to audience questions right now, and we've got quite a few. And people have been upvoting their favorite questions, so I will start with at the top. Lars asks, how did the AI actually identify the ink? Can you give more info on that? I know you touched on it a little bit, but.
Do you want me to, or do you want to take it?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, you have this 3D volume of a flattened papyrus, and Casey looked at it and said, I think these crackle areas are ink. And so then you basically train a model on labels where you've sort of highlighted the crackle areas, and you use a convolutional network that has a very small tile size that's much smaller than a letter form, so it can't hallucinate letters or even strokes. So, because when we found when we used big tiles, it was like inventing letters and adding strokes, and it looked very like, Federica said it looked like it was a fake, basically, I think. And then you sort of iteratively train. So you basically train it on where you think you see ink, it finds more ink, then you kind of look at that and you extend the labels a little bit and you train a new model, and then you just keep doing that again and again until whole paragraphs start to emerge. And that's our best current technique. If you have a better idea, please come help us.
Let me say that every piece of that is labor intensive. So finding the places that you would like to label, experimenting with the architectures of all of the options for how the machine learning can be trained. That's the brilliance of the contest. Many contestants really kicked the tires on all of those parameters, right? Allowing us to hone in on a set of things that work pretty well for the scrolls that we have. Now we're trying to broaden that to figure out what's the Uber approach that works on every one of all 400 scrolls, right?
Yeah. Somebody also asked, how do you know the text being recovered is correct? Have there been instances where two teams have recovered conflicting text?
I think I partly answered that with the tile size thing. We basically have rules to try to eliminate hallucination, and then we rely on experts. I mean, this was when we were talking about starting this contest, I was like, Brent, someone's going to submit an image, and I won't know if it's real or not, and then we have to decide whether to give them money. Maybe they photoshopped it. I have no idea. Like, how will I know? And so Brent had the smart idea to involve papyrologists in the review. And so we basically, we try to rerun their submissions to make sure they produce similar images, and we look at the code to make sure it's not, it's not cheating. And then we give it to Federica and her team, and they read it and see if it's real.
Yeah, and I think it was very important for us to know that they weren't, so the AI wasn't looking for letters, so it wasn't doing any kind of what's called HTR, so handwritten text recognition. It was just revealing the ink for us to read it. And that was very important for us to trust it, of course. And at the same time, we were asked to, for example, to check if there were recurring patterns in the images that might have come from some kind of hallucination or repeating patterns. Or we were also comparing, so when we had to evaluate the submissions to be able to assign prizes, we were comparing the different submissions. It was interesting with the grand prize because we got, I think at the end as a papyrology team, we got 12 submissions. And comparing them, we could see that they all showed the same text. So with different degrees of legibility and, of course, more or less noise in the image or this kind of things, but they were all showing compatible strokes, compatible letters, and that was for us an important way to, to build our trust.
We do get crackpot submissions where people say they found like maps of the world and lots of drawings of animals and stuff like that. But yeah, maybe, we don't think so. We don't think so.
One of the notes I got was, if you want to read a carbonized Herculaneum scroll, we have the date. So go back to the time before it was carbonized. So the answer is build a time machine.
Okay.
So why don't you just do that instead of all this other stuff?
Might be easier than this.
It might be easier.
It's actually a good idea.
Randy asks, how did you curate the presumably very large data set to train these AI models?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, the data sets are not large by generative AI standards. For training a large language model, the web itself is only just big enough. So by those standards, our data sets are tiny. However, a scan scroll at 8 microns is like a terabyte-ish. And so for working on your laptop, it gets a little bit unwieldy. But the data sets for ink detection are these sort of hand-labeled or iteratively labeled sets. And so we try to release everything we can to the community. So, the scroll scans, the raw scans, the segmentations, the flattened segmentations, and then labeled ink data sets. We kind of try to put all out there. And quality control is a big challenge for sure, which is why we had to bring some of that labeling in-house. And we actually have, gosh, I don't know, more than a dozen labelers that we pay full-time right now, producing we're trying a new technique for the segmentation where the papyrus plant has fibers in it, which I guess give it strength. And instead of just labeling the surface, the inner surface of the wound papyrus, we found that it was a little bit easier to label the fibers. And you can differentiate the vertical or the vertical and the horizontal fibers. And so we have, and there's a cool tool that we found called Webnosis, which was actually made for neuroconnectome labeling, I think. That's probably not the right term, but it was for labeling the connections between neurons and brain scans. And then we found out there's a whole industry of people who do this stuff in Ukraine and some other places. So we have all these Ukrainian neuro data set people who are labeling scrolls right now, which is pretty cool. And the visualization's interesting. They kind of fly through it and they try to like follow the fiber. So,
also want to note the irony that for all of the fragmentary witness that we have from the physical openings, we have 10 times more fragmentary witness, but it's all virtual, right? So we have all of these fragments, but they're all sorted and stored in a computer database, right, as opposed to physical labeling, right?
This question I thought was interesting. Why are the Latin ones more damaged than the Greek ones?
Yeah, that's an interesting problem because we don't know precisely why. It is possible that they were stored somewhere in the library where they were hit more severely by the eruption, by carbonization. It is also possible that some of the Latin papyri that were well preserved or preserved not too bad were not opened. So of course we don't know that they're Latin for now. But yeah, it is strange that in a Roman villa we have found so many Greek papyri and just 100 Latin scrolls. So the Greek papyri are probably around 800, 900 books, and the Latin ones are around 100. That's strange. So as Nat was saying before, it is possible that the Latin part of the library was somewhere else in the villa, and we haven't found it yet. That's a possibility.
That was actually somebody, I was just looking at a question somebody asked. The library was one room in the private villa. Would scrolls in the undiscovered main library in Herculaneum be in the same condition?
Yeah, so the library was actually not stored all in one room, in just one room. So we found papyri in several different locations at the villa. So we found some papyri on the floor and in boxes between the two peristyles, so in the area of the so-called tablinum of the villa, which is the area where guests came to meet the owner of the villa. And then most of the papyri were found in a very small room, like 3 by 3 meters room, like an internal room, probably used for storage because it wasn't receiving natural light from outside, so it probably wasn't a place where you would like to read, to consult a book, so it was probably more like a deposit. But it is pretty clear from the findings that the papyri were moved here and there. So we don't know, of course, if there were other storage locations in the villa. And what we know for sure, for example, there are some papyri, this is an interesting fact about the library, all the works, all the books that contain works by a specific author, Demetrius Laco, a philosopher, an Epicurean philosopher himself, they all are kind of lighter than the other papyri. And we don't know why, because they're dating from different eras, so we would need to do material analysis on all the scroll across the collection to be able to understand that. But it's possible that they were stored somewhere else in comparison to the rest of the collection. So there might be a difference in the locations where the papyri were found, and this is also possible for Latin papyri, for example.
Somebody asked about, was the project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities? In part?
No.
No? Okay.
It was originally funded by me, and then my friend Daniel, and then we launched the project. Brent and I had this really bright idea to launch on the Ides of March. We thought that was a good idea in 2023, and the problem with that was that GPT-4 came out like the day before, and so nobody noticed when we launched. And then Brent told me, wait a minute, they say beware the Ides of March. Like, we shouldn't have launched on the Ides of March. And he was right. And so basically we launched and nobody noticed, and the whole idea of the project was that people would notice it and want to work on it. And so I was despondent. And that weekend I was like, okay, we have to relaunch somehow, but we already like tweeted about this, so we need some news. And so the only idea we could think of was to raise some more money so the prizes could be bigger. I think I put $100,000 and Daniel put $100,000, something like that originally. And so I started texting some friends and just saying, like, do you want to give? We're doing this, we're gonna resurrect this ancient library from this volcanic eruption. And they were all like, no, that is not gonna work. But out of like 10 or 20 friends I texted, 2 said yes, or maybe 3, and they were going to give small amounts of money. So I thought, okay, I'll announce this tomorrow on Twitter, and maybe some other people will want to donate. And I remember saying to somebody I was with, like, should I just do one tweet where I say, you know, we raised $75,000 from 3 people, or should I do 3 separate tweets? And then I was like, I'll do 3 separate ones. It'll seem like there's some momentum. I'll space them out a few minutes. I thought maybe I'd shake loose another $50,000 or something, but then it really worked like crazy. It became like this thing where everyone had to donate to the Scrolls project, and we raised like $1 million that day. So that was really cool. We spent it all already. It's gone. So that was cool. So it was just people on Twitter, friends, and people on Twitter. And then the biggest donation we got was randomly Elon Musk said that he would donate $2 million, and then he did. So that was amazing. It was hugely helpful. It funded a lot of the work that we did over the last year and a half. And then we had another anonymous person who I can't reveal donate some more money recently. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just been private individuals for at least the Vesuvius Challenge part of this.
Yeah, the Vesuvius Challenge has been very, very well funded, and we appreciate the generosity of the contributors. There isn't a federal program, actually, where you can write a proposal that says, we would like you to give us $1 million so that we can give it all away in prizes, right? No. So our prior funding to the Vesuvius Challenge was to the National Science Foundation, for example, and to the National Endowment for the Humanities, to do the kind of work universities do with research assistants, with my research team. And we've been well funded for the decade before Vesuvius Challenge, but there was no way with that kind of portfolio for funding we could do something like the challenge. It had to come from private philanthropy, so that's been a huge boost.
Well, I think this will be our last question, and I suspect I know what the answer is, but somebody asked, how can I help you? What is the process to collaborate? Go to
scrollprize.org and do the tutorials. Buy some papyrus on Amazon. Make your own charred scroll, and yeah, I don't know. See if you can find some ink. That would be really helpful.
Although, maybe a more nuanced response to that is, who are you, and what do you do, and how much money do you have?
That's what I assumed the answer was going to be.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. What a fantastic panel. I'm going to give them another round of applause. And what a great evening and a great example of how AI is decoding the past and ushering in a scientific future. Feedback is so important, so I'd love for everybody in the audience to please take our survey. If you scan the QR code, your feedback really helps us shape future programs. Speaking of future programs, we hope you'll join us on August 26th. It's called 1995, the Internet's Big Bang. This will focus on the year the web went from a geeky curiosity to a global phenomena. You're going to get to hear from guests like Netscape co-founder Jim Clark, as well as former Microsoft exec Brad Silverberg. And if you're an early netizen, this is going to be a special event you don't want to miss. We've been talking a little bit about funding. This is where I tell you that it's been a really challenging time for museums, as folks may know. So we appreciate any support that you can give us so we can keep doing great events like this. Again, if you scan the QR code or visit computerhistory.org. So just again, thank you for this incredible panel. Thank you all for joining us and helping us build a community here at CHM. Have a great evening.